I want to start off just by welcoming everyone to our meeting and coming to this event, which is going to be fabulous. But I also would like to welcome, we have a new board member, Lauren Lynn, and I don't know if she's actually here. She was here, I don't know if she was here. Well, we have a new board member. Her name is Lauren Flynn, and we're happy to welcome her onto the WPS board. I'm going to turn this over to Kristen, who wants to make some announcements about our presentation this evening. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to introduce Pat Muse. Eileen and I attended a meeting at the Center for Slavery and Justice at Brown University. And this had been organized by the as part of the Middle Passage Ceremony and Port Marker Project, is their official name. They'd asked other community groups in Warren to participate, and WPS decided to go. And we were there because Providence, Newport, Warren, and Bristol have been recognized as slave ports in Rhode Island. And I just wanted to say that kind of in reflection, looking back at the meeting, it was a little bit of an awkward meeting. There were a lot of people there. It was very academic in some ways, and we kind of felt like, what can we do? We're such a small group. We don't really know a lot about the history of slavery in Warren. And how are we ever going to compete with towns like Providence, like the cities really like Providence and Newport, to participate in this project? But thankfully, Pat Muse said that she would be willing to chair the Warren Committee. And she famously said, Warren is a small town, but don't worry, we will get this done. And she was right. And I was going to say that was right. And so I'd like to introduce the committee for the Warren Middle Passage Project. The members are Julie Blount, which Julie is here somewhere. Oh, you're right. Tony Cardoza, Otis Reed, Sandy Scott, John Stevenson, Steve Thompson, Sarah Wheat, and Pat Muse. Over the last 6 months, they've been researching, reading, doing work online, reading all kinds of historical documents from a variety of sources, and they've put together this presentation for us tonight. So here we go. We're ready to see Warren 19 years in the slave trade. Thank you.
As Kristen said, we went to a meeting on slavery. What she didn't mention, I don't know if it was that meeting or the next, is probably that one. They kept talking about the Middle Passage. I did not know what the Middle Passage was, but I certainly learned as the meeting went on. I learned that the Middle Passage is, and was, basically 2 months of hell. We all, I think, kind of know the triangle trade, right? And it was all kind of vague. Somewhere here they made rum. They went over to Africa. They bought people. They brought them back. They sold them. They got sugar and molasses, and they went up north somewhere. This is the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage took usually at a minimum 2 months. And that's not including the time that slaves could be sitting here waiting for the boat to get full. And I shouldn't say slaves, I should say Africans, because they aren't slaves yet. Rhode Island's 4 towns accounted for nearly half of the slave trade voyages out of America. And we did lots of research. We did research from historical societies, from the town hall. Sarah did a lot of research at the Rhode Island Historical Society and all sorts of documents. In Rhode Island Historical Society, they have a 65 feet on the Bristol Warren Custom House, which is where ships would have had to check in, check out. In 1696, the British ship Seaflower arrived in Newport with slaves. It was a British ship that brought slaves to Newport. in 1714, the first American slave ship, meaning not a British ship, left Newport. It was the beginning of the slave trade. It was called the Hummingbird. The group that this is all about is the Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project. Their program was established about 5 years ago to honor the 2 million captives who died during that Middle Passage and the 10 million who came to the Americas and, I would say, built America. Thank you. Sarah? Oh, no, we're not done. We're not done. Thank you.
At first, the slave trade was controlled by the European powers, but in 1713, Britain opened the slave trade to the American colonies. Newport, Rhode Island's largest town and a major maritime center, took the lead. Within 2 years, slavery was legalized in Rhode Island, and that was a green light for slavers. Over the next 60 years, there would be 500 voyages from Rhode Island to Africa. Nearly 60,000 men, women, and children were purchased in Africa. 10,000 died during the journey, and the remaining 50,000 were sold into slavery, either in the Caribbean or the American colonies, with some usually brought back to Rhode Island. And we can see that when we look at the 1774 census that was done by order of King George. It gives us a unique snapshot of Rhode Island's population before the Revolution. There were 59,000 inhabitants, including 1,479 Indians and 3,668 blacks. Slaves lived in every city and town, but the numbers are largest in 2 areas for different reasons. South County, which in those days included Jamestown, North and South Kingstown, had actual plantations, so they accounted for 20% of the enslaved. The other large groups are in what were the major slave trading towns, Providence, Bristol, and Newport, where wealthy businessmen and slave traders owned people for commercial and domestic labor. In Newport, 1 in 7 residents was an enslaved black person. Here in Warren, with a total population of 979 residents, 44 enslaved people were listed as part of households. There are some familiar names here. All told, 25 households in Warren owned slaves. The number after the name is the number of slaves within that household. Since most people lived in the compact part of town, it seems likely that those houses with 1 enslaved person were probably used for domestic labor. But for those with more, we think they were used as a slave labor on the wharves or on a farm. Notice John Mason. He was a farmer, and he had 7 slaves. We should also take note of the fact that 1774 was the year slave importation to Rhode Island was declared illegal. There are 4 names in red: Robert Carr, Benjamin Cole, Ebenezer Cole, and Nathan Miller. In 1774, those 4 slave owners made up the majority on the 6-member town council. People involved in the slave trade would continue to serve on the council for many decades, with many more holding other positions of power in town. Benjamin and Ebenezer Cole, just 2 examples, were elected to the council more than 30 times between them. As you can see, among the child households, there were a dozen slaves. Why so many? Where did they come from? Knowing that Warren had an excellent reputation for shipbuilding, the Childs in particular, we had wondered if Warren was building slave ships for others long before Warrenites headed to Africa on their own ships. Until 2 weeks ago, we had nothing to support that theory. But then, I came upon a master's thesis about slave ships by Jessica Glickman. She got her master's at URI in marine archaeology and studied the records of Aaron Lopez, a major slave trader in Newport and a founder of the Truro Synagogue. Among his thousands of papers, there were many mentions of Warren, including an agreement dated December of 1774, before the war, between Sylvester Child and Aaron Lopez. And then we had proof that Warren had been in the slave trade for 34 years, not 19. This is an order for a slave ship. We know that because it specifies a space of 4 feet 6 inches between decks. The standard height for a slave hold. And you have to wonder, Sylvester Child owned 4 slaves when he signed that agreement. Were they forced to help build a slave ship? But once the Revolutionary War began, no slave ship left Rhode Island for 9 years. It was just too dangerous to be on the Atlantic. Newport, Bristol, and Warren were all hard hit during the war, but they rebuilt quickly, and in 1784, Newport's Eliza was the first ship to leave. By 1786, slave voyages were up to pre-war levels, with the Brown family of Providence and the DeWolf family of Bristol becoming more involved. But Warren still did not launch its own slave ships. Why did they hesitate?
If you look here, these are the slave laws, Rhode Island, and then we get to national, that sort of surround the Revolutionary War. In 1774, slave importation becomes illegal in Rhode Island. That's before the war. From the things that I read, it appeared the legislature was really grappling with this issue. You know, we had abolitionists, there were those who owned slaves. It was a very mixed group. So that first one was the first one. Let's just not bring any more in. If you have them, you can keep them, but no more. We had the Revolutionary War, we had life, liberty, all that. And after the war, I guess that stuck a little, because they voted for the Rhode Island Gradual Emancipation Law, which some other states did too. What that said was, as of March 1st, 1784, if an enslaved woman gives birth to a child, that child will not be a slave when they get to adulthood. They will be indentured, and then they will be they will be set free. So that would stop slavery from being passed from mother to child, to child, to child. Then in 1787, they decided to go, and that should say residence, not residence. They decided to go the whole way, and participation in the slave trade became illegal if you were a resident of Rhode Island. There were some strange cases that went to court, and basically the law didn't stick. It was the law, but it didn't stick. Then in 1789, and I don't know who here knows this, because I was like shocked. In Article 1, Clause 9 of the Constitution, it says that we will not discuss slavery for 20 years. It will not be made illegal for 20 years. And so that meant that slavery would be legal at least until 1808. My opinion is that that was, the slave traders said, that's the deadline. We better get out there and get them. Because the numbers, that's when you see the numbers really go up.
So we're going to take a step back. Nope, great. We're going to take a step back and focus on Warren's shipbuilding history. So early explorers of the Inland Coast had noticed plentiful supplies of timber and good harbors with low-lying shores from which ships could be launched. For Warren, The existence of a deep water channel made it a prime location for shipbuilding and all the industries associated with the industry, such as rope walks, cooperages, forges, and sail lofts. Warren and Providence, and to a lesser extent Bristol and Newport, developed shipbuilding in the late 17th century. After the slave trade was outlawed, the industry revived with the development of whaling. By 1830, Warren was building 3 times as many ships as Providence and twice as many ships as Bristol. The earliest map we have of Warren is the Walling map of 1851. And this shows you there are about 16 wharves. It doesn't show the whole map. We're just kind of focusing on the middle section here. But I just want to point out some of the wharves here. The Luther Wharf, it's not really clear, but the Luther Wharf was on the end of Company Street on the north side, and also the J.T. Childs Wharf, which is John Child, was on the south side of Miller Street. And these were the first 2 shipways in existence about prior to 1730. And the Barton Wharf was at the end of Miller Street, and that actually is the wharf that the Wharf Tavern is sitting on. The Baker Wharf at the foot of Baker Street, that was actually it was built around 1760. Actually, you can't see it here, but the Joseph Smith Wharf, located on the north side of Church Street, and also Sylvester Child's shipyard was located on Bowen's Wharf. The Collin Wharf was located right where the town wharf is, and Captain Collins' house was located directly across the street. The Carr Wharf is actually kind of where it's at the foot of Washington Street, and it's on the north side, and you can kind of see it. It's where Trafford's is right there. And then you've got, and actually that was named after Robert Carr, who established his shipyard there in 1712. The Caleb Eddy was situated on the south side of Washington Street, and that was the former place of the Cromwell and Caleb Childs shipyard. And then you have the Gardner Brown Wharf that's at the foot of Broad Street, and actually that's where Blount Seafood is. And I can't forget to mention the Wheaton and Baker Rope Walk, which is along Warren Avenue between Liberty and Main Street. So there's really quite a lot of activity of shipbuilding. Warren was a prominent shipbuilding port. So just to give you an idea of the environment in a shipyard and the trades that were involved. A master shipbuilder employed carpenters or journeymen shipbuilders. Sawyers operated on the site, as sawmills could not provide all the odd-shaped pieces and the unusual lengths of timber required for shipbuilding. Joiners smoothed outside planking, built deck rails and finished cabins. Plankers and liners did the deck planking, and caulkers filled the seams with oakum and pitch. The next job was to step the masts. Rope makers twisted fibers into rope, cable. Sails were made from linen and hemp canvas and seamed together with strong twine. Blacksmiths, known as shipsmiths, made everything from the axle to the forging of anchors. And the ship was finished by a whole group of painters, glazers, coopers, and riggers. The average workday in a shipyard was about 12 hours, possibly more, from sunrise to sunset. It was customary to serve a ration of rum, which was considered a necessary expense for shipbuilding. And a shipyard could employ up to 150 or more employees. I know at the Mason Barney they had up to 250. The actual shipbuilding operation was not lengthy for small vessels, like the ships that the Warrens, like many of the Warren slave ships. Hulls could be completed in as little as 6 weeks, depending upon the size of the ship and the number of men employed. The cutting of timber locally and the task of rigging and outfitting each vessel required 2 to 4 weeks. And for larger ships of several hundred tons, like the ones that we built for slavers, the construction could take up to 2 years or more. These are 3 types of vessels, a schooner, a sloop, and a brig, that were typically used for slave ships. And the vessels which left Warren were generally smaller, requiring less crew. And they were built to meet the growing demand of lighter and faster boats. Some vessels were modified to hold human beings, and others were designed and built specifically for the slave trade.
These would be some of the typical outfitting and provisions for a cargo. You can see there's everything from onions, which were used to help fight scurvy, to shackles, guns, handcuffs, bread. They stored the bread in big barrels. Everything was preserved in barrels, preserved meats. And then we move on to look at the sections of a slave ship. What we are getting to is the point in 1789 where Warren sends out his first slave ship. The name of her was the Abigail. She was a schooner, and 4 men decided that it was time for Warren to start slave trading. It was Ebenezer Cole, who had been was on the town council for 11 terms, Captain Charles Collins, who was on the town council for 3 terms, and James and Level Maxwell, who often held high positions in town. They were well known. They decided to go in on a slave ship. It would be configured roughly like this. If you look here, here's where you would put the rum and all the provisions that you would need for the trip. Right here. That's that deck to be laid of 4.5 feet, where they would force the Africans into that. If you look here, this is looking down on the ship. These are the metal gratings that would allow some air down into that hole. And this is a swivel gun. The swivel gun can shoot in, it can shoot out. So if there was any trouble, they would man that gun and shoot whoever came up out of that grate. What's interesting to note is that this ship, the Abigail, left on September 23rd. That's tomorrow. So we are on the eve, 227 years ago, of the first slave ship out of Warren. So tonight they would have been getting the last provisions in, the potatoes and the onions and all of those we put on the ship right now. The crew, probably about half a dozen, would be saying goodbye to their families. And tomorrow morning, Captain Collins will step out of his house on Water Street, walk across the street to his dock, to his wharf, and get on the Abigail and head to Africa. He will not come back for 8 months. But while he's gone, he will go to Africa and he will imprison 74 Africans on his ship. 11 of them will die during the journey. And they would just throw the bodies overboard. And when he got back, there were 63 in the Caribbean to be enslaved. Then, in 1794, that ship went out in 1789. In 1794, the U.S. Slave Act prohibits slave trade between the U.S. and foreign countries. That means you shouldn't be trading in slaves. we have till 1808 until they're going to stop slavery. So this didn't stop the slave traders. The second time that Warren went out was the Abigail again. It had new owners, Captain Pardon Bowen and Jonathan Hale. And we know more about their trip. They went to the Gold Coast of Africa. They got about the same number of Africans as the last one. The same number died. And then they landed in Saint Martin. And Saint Martin had, like a lot of the islands down there, had sugarcane plantations. And those people were sold onto the sugar plantation, where the average lifespan was 7 years if you were a slave. You could die because a machete slipped, because you got an infection in your foot from the cane. You got some disease. There were a lot of them. You were malnourished the whole time because a lot of the people that owned the slaves said it was cheaper to buy a new one. You were beaten. You might be raped. You might die in childbirth. And that's what happened when you were on the plantation. And after that was all over, those men, Captain Pardon Bowen, cleaned the ship, loaded it with molasses and sugar, and brought it back to Rhode Island to be distilled into rum. And then Warren's own slave trade began in earnest.
This is the list of men who were both slave ship owners and captains. To take on these roles meant you were willing to buy people, imprison them, and let some die, sell most of them into slavery, and then come home. But the potential profits were high and seemed fine to some men. Those in red were slave owners in 1774. The number after each name is the number of voyages each man took. This is the list of people, including one woman, who invested in at least one slave ship voyage. Only one had owned a slave in 1774. This last list is of slave ship captains who were not investors or owners. They couldn't afford that. They were usually paid about the same as the crew, with a certain number of slaves to sell as their bonus. Now we will show you all the slave voyages with Warren involvement that are found on the slavevoyages.com website, which was compiled from ship's registers and other records at Emory University. For most voyages, some information is missing from the records, and so numbers are based upon other information when possible. We also have information on slave ships, larger ones, that were constructed in Warren for the DeWolf brothers in Bristol. Many of the enslaved would end up on the DeWolf sugar plantations, though we know some were brought back to Bristol. Altogether, these voyages add up to horrific numbers. 2,876 men, women, and children were taken from Africa. 474 died during the Middle Passage. 2,402 were sold into slavery in the Caribbean or North America.
Pretty frightening. Profits from this slave trade helped to build Warren. We all have to just recognize that fact. Its homes, its businesses, and its institutions. So in the future, when we write about Warren, let's find a way to be a little more honest than using terms like we engaged in the West India trade, which is what it says on the town website. And consider more accurate descriptions for men involved in the slave trade than calling them mariners, or merchants, or just plain sea captains. And when we talk about our historic buildings and institutions, maybe we should think about talking about how their owners and founders profited from the slave trade. Here are 4 houses to consider. The Betsy Burr on 18 Washington Street. It was on Main Street next to Burr's Tavern. It was moved to its present location. That was owned by Betsy Burr, wife of Shubael Burr, a slave owner in 1774, and the owner captain of 2 slave ships, the William in 1799 and the Lark in 1800. Sorry. The Miller Abbott House. Revolutionary War hero Nathan Miller, who I'm sure everybody that was brought up here heard about him, also enslaved 2 people for decades. The 1774 census lists 2 slaves in his household. The inventory when he died in July of 1790 lists 1 Negro woman. Also in 1790, there was a census after his death. And his wife, widow Rebecca, who would have been the head of the household, reported having 2 slaves living with her. So we can assume that those slaves lived in that house. The Rebecca Maxwell Phillips house. This house was given to Rebecca Maxwell by her father, James Maxwell, who was a wharf owner and part owner of the first slave ship, Abigail, in 1789. And our last house is the Eddy Cutler house, which kind of covers all the bases. The land was owned by John Child, who was a town councilman, a slave owner in 1774, and we know now he was a slave ship builder before the Revolutionary War. He sold the property to Captain Benjamin Eddy in July of 1806. We know Eddy was the owner-captain of at least 2 slave voyages, the Eliza in 1801 and the Agent in 1806. The Agent sailed to Sierra Leone, where 179 Africans were purchased and imprisoned, the largest number ever carried on a Warren slave ship. 19 died during the voyage. The surviving 157 were sold into slavery in Charleston. That could have been slavery on the rice plantations, or at that point, they were shipping people to cotton slave labor camps towards the west. And that was god-awful. That was god-awful. So he sold these people into slavery, and at the time, those slaves would have sold for nearly $55,000. We estimate that a grand house like Captain Eddy's would have cost about $4,000. The Middle Passage Ceremonies and Port Markers Project was created to remember the Africans who died or became enslaved. It has led our group to consider the full history of our small town. In the spring, we plan to present our research on those who were enslaved here and were hopefully freed here. We also look forward to community discussion on the location and design of the marker and plans for remembrance ceremony here in Warren. We hope you will all be a part of that discussion. Thank you.
I'm going to stand up for a minute, and if I can speak sitting down. I'm Bonnie Warren, and I have actually written on both Warren and Bristol. And I have not written on the slave trade. So I am fascinated with what you guys have turned up, because you are using resources that we did not use. But I want to, two resource categories that I have used, and you did not mention. So I'd like to bring them to your attention. While you were speaking, I picked up a couple. For the town of Warren, I worked on the tricentennial and bicentennial book, and I did Captain John Mason's home in Tawisset. Now, you mentioned Captain John Mason. His will is filed in Warren Town Hall. He was a slave owner. You had mentioned here that he had 9. I found his will accidentally because it was Massachusetts where he lived, and it became Warren in 1746. He dies in, I think it was 1745, but they filed the will in Warren, and I literally ran into it. He gave freedom to all his slaves in his will. He specifies their names, their ages, and their sex. And it's early. It's before anything is outlawed. He is a very solid Baptist. So I think that one resource you have not touched are wills.
No, we
And
have.
excuse
We
me.
have.
Wait,
There are wills here.
wait a minute, may I continue? Excuse me, I'll just get it off my chest and then you can pick me apart. I've also worked extensively in Barrington. Matthew Allen, there are a lot of people from Warren who bought all the big Barrington farms. Barrington is the breadbasket. The sea captain, Captain Drown, buys up that comes to Drownville. Matthew Allen owns all the land from Alfred Drown Road south to the country club. His son Thomas Allen is the general for all of the revolutionary forces. His slaves, and they're mentioned in the census, are buried in the Allen Cemetery with the family, and they got freedom because they fought in the Revolution. If you were going to carry a gun and fight against the British, you got your freedom. Now that's a fascinating, and those records are available. So it's a little bit, I'm bringing this up because I see your work as fascinating, exciting, but not complete. I think there are other resources out there
That's the
that
other
I
half.
hope you're able to go more thoroughly with more time. You just can't do something like this in 6 months. It's too big. And I've worked with a lot of the Bristol records. They also gave freedom, and people won their freedom. So those are 2 categories I want to bring to your attention.
In
If I sit down, I
the
can't
spring,
stand up.
our presentation is on the enslaved. What happened to them? So we knew that there was way too much for us to do in one presentation, probably way too much to do in 6 presentations. So when we started looking at the wills and inventories, we found names like we did for, that's Matthew Allen, I think, the one that we listed here. And our hope is to find all of those people that we can find through the wills and inventories. And I know there's someone here who has records on a number of these people. And look at them and look at their lives. Because regardless, they were enslaved. Somebody may have let them free, but they were enslaved until somebody decided to let them free.
I understand that, but to cast the general picture and the implication that everybody was involved in it, there were some people who were against it for religious reasons, for cultural reasons, and they took action, and I think that needs to be recognized in your work.
When we find it, we will report it.
I mean,
I believe you mentioned one of the vessels is the Dolphin,
The Dolphin, yes.
and it had question marks as to like what ended up happening to that boat. I don't know if it's the same boat, but I believe the Dolphin is the one that they found the keel of down at the south end of Chile a couple of years ago. Eileen remembers this. Remember when that guy sent us the pictures and so forth? So if it's the same vessel, you might be able to connect a couple of dots. Cool.
Have you found descendants of the slaves here in Warren and Bristol?
She asked if we found descendants of slaves in Warren or in Bristol. That work is the hardest work because people might have had the same name as the person who owned them. They might have changed their name. It's very difficult work, and also some of the reading that we've been doing said that a lot of people, when they were in the smaller towns, whether it was Warren or other places, once they gained their freedom, they went where there were a larger number of blacks or of no longer enslaved people, whether that was Newport or Providence. It was kind of a small town to be a slave in, or to be a free person.
I did a series for Rhode Island Roots on Black and Indian sailors born in Rhode Island. I took all the custom house records from all the areas in Bedford all the way down to Connecticut, just seeking out the blacks and Indians born in Rhode Island. And this particular issue I did one on the Bristol Customs House records. And I've got about 4 or 5 pages. And like you say, you have all the names of all the ship captains or the prominent families in town of actually, there was only a few that were born in Warren, claimed they were born in Warren from their protection oaths, which was their citizenship papers, so they wouldn't be taken by the British Navy.
We looked at those, yeah.
Yeah. Just a lot of the Millers and all the common Warren names, the Thurbers and Mark Anthony Howe Tanner, or Richard Allen, all former slaves who went into the maritime trades because it was basically the only job they could do. Ended up chasing them all around the world to try and find them.
Tulissa Historical Society. It's fairly new, like 6 months, called If Jane Should Want to Be Freed.
That's Little Compton.
That's Tulissa Little Compton. And it's really quite fascinating. It's really taken from wills. And in the case of Jane, she had a choice. If she could have been sold if she wanted to somebody else.
Yes, Sarah and I went down to that exhibition.
Yeah.
I think is it done? Is it over yet?
October 18th.
October 18th. It's a great exhibition.
But you can buy the book from Little Compton Historical Society, or for that matter, from the big bad bookseller people like Amazon.
We didn't get to mention this earlier, but we have some material that you can take with you. One is the Slavery and Justice booklet that describes the Brown University project related to slavery. Another is the list of resources of what we've consulted. This is probably 1/5 of what we've consulted. We just thought that we would give you a shorter version, and eventually the whole thing will be on the website for Warren Preservation Society. And then here's a handout about the triangle trade in the Middle Passage. So when you leave, feel free to pick up this packet. There's also a little brochure about the Slavery and Justice Center at Brown University, which is a really neat historic building worth dropping into.
And the big piece that Sarah is holding, it also has a lot on slavery in Rhode Island, not just Brown University and the Brown family. Dory?
I just wanted to let everybody know that the Bristol Historical Society has having a presentation on October 24th. It's a Monday night. It will be in Rogers Free Library in the Hilltop Community Room in the lower level. And we're having Ray Rickman come, and the title of his talk is How to Talk About Slavery in 2016. And he does do, he will be talking about Pat was talking about with the economic benefit to Rhode Island because of the slave trade. And it involved so many people because of that. So you're all welcome to come to that. That's 7 p.m. Monday, October 24th. How to Talk About Slavery in 2016.
Any other questions or comments?
Can I say something ridiculously probably bold, but just because it was part of a conversation today as I got to enjoy this beautiful waterway on my boat. And we were talking about slavery in a different way. I think I mentioned I was coming here, but there's a different form of slavery that's going on the planet, and we were talking about it at great length today. So I'd like to just bring our attention to that too, because I think the two things go hand in hand.
Which slavery?
The slavery that's going on the planet, just the enslavement of the sex slavery trade, I guess. So.
Well, I mean, really, if you think about
It's
it,
very different, but very much the same, and I just wanted to make it contemporary.
this was early human trafficking. You know, it would sound more shocking if we said that there had been all these human trafficking ships nowadays, right? Any other questions? Yes? Yeah.
Yes, one of the investment properties that we owned was at the corner of Baker and Water. I think the number was 236, but I'm not 100% sure. But down the cellar, there was one room that had 2 windows facing 2 different ways at the corner, and there were bars in the windows, and it was there were bars on the door. And when we renovated it, we left that downstairs the way it was, but we tied into it from the apartment above. But no one wanted to rent that unit, and the reason was they felt that it was scary to them because it must have been that there were slaves that were stored.
What year was your house built?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know any of that.
David, do you know?
1770s maybe.
So what happened to it?
It's right across from the Baker Street
It's still there.
Park,
Yes.
Children's Park.
Oh,
It wasn't kept as historic.
I don't know.
It's at the bottom of this street.
Yeah, I don't know. We haven't really gotten the impression so far that that the slaves that were here in town were were locked up and put away, sort of, because we're a small, very small town. Everybody knew everybody. And they were probably people that were allowed to go around town. Where were you going to escape to in Warren? Joe?
I think that the most obvious first enslaved people that we may not realize as obvious, and although your work is credited towards the African slave trade and duly noted and good job, but the natives were the first enslaved
That was
population.
the first part of the, I think you missed the
I
start.
came in late, so thank you for recognizing that, because it always puts a chill up my spine to see on our town hall, as well as all of our names, are all of the original inhabitants.
That's also mentioned in this handout that we're giving to everyone too. I think too that, it's okay. I think we really too wanted to make the point that Warren was not a point of disembarkation, that we were in the trade, but it does not mean that a ship would come here with the slaves. They were either taken to the West Indies, Charleston, or some other port. So we're in kind of an interesting situation because Providence, Newport, and Bristol did have disembarked slaves, but ours probably, we assume, kind of came from Bristol, probably. That would make sense that at that customs house and at that site they would get off and then got here some other way. But we aren't positive, and that's one thing we really want to track and find out. But it's, as usual, Warren's unique.
And the Captain Collins that we talked about, who was a slave ship captain, his son, just like one of those tawdry little things, his son went to Bristol, married the DeWolf's wife's sister, and he became the custom house guy when the DeWolf family wanted to do slave work, and they got a guy named Ellery who was strict. And they said, we can't put up with this. We need somebody who's going to let us do what we want to do. They wrote to Thomas Jefferson, seriously, and said, we like you, we're going to help you politically, please let us give us a custom house in Bristol, there was one in Providence and one in Newport, and let us pick the guy. And they said, oh, Jefferson said, okay. And so Captain Charles Collins not Captain Charles Collins, his son became the customs house guy, who was paid, we looked at the bank records in Bristol, he got paid easily $500, sometimes $1,000 a week from the DeWolfs.
That was the midnight tax.
And he had one of the grandest houses in Bristol.
And he had what?
One of the grandest houses in Bristol.
In Bristol, I don't believe we've ever really found any evidence of massive bringing slaves into Bristol. They didn't do that any more than they did here. They did take them to Cuba, Savannah, and Charleston for the most part, but they didn't bring large numbers into Bristol.
No, I don't think they did either, but there are records that show that the DeWolfs brought some to be the slaves in their own homes and things like that.
And we have their names, and we know when their children died and everything, because it was all in the newspaper at the time.
Newport had a lot because they were such a huge harbor, and they brought a lot of Africans back to work on the wharf and to work, There was one who was a chocolatier in Newport.
What about slaves that would have been in other parts of New England? Because, it's known that Massachusetts, for example, and some of the other states used slaves for farms and other kinds of businesses as well. Did they come in through Rhode Island?
There was slave ships came into Boston.
Oh, okay.
Another note on the DeWolf, when they were renovating the DeWolf, the warehouse, the stone warehouse down on the waterfront, there were still shackles that had been left there when it was used as a lumber yard all these years when it was Wardrow, JT Lumber. And from what I understood, they removed them when they put the restaurant in there.
Any other comments or questions? Any of you who have an interest, have information, we would love you to get involved. And we'll be back in the spring with whatever we have found through our work looking for the enslaved and those who were freed. And in the fall, we hope to have the marker. We hope to have a marker and a remembrance ceremony here in Warren. So thank you all for coming. Thank you.